The story of hope is in the everyday people, and I can't emphasize that enough. I know it sounds so cliched, but it really is true. I mean, that movement was made possible by everyday people understanding the larger human rights implication of taking away bodily autonomy, because that's what this is about. It's not just the right to one specific medical procedure. It's all the rights you have about your body. It's trans rights. It's who you can marry. It's, when you, how you can work and have accommodations, all the different things that matter to our bodies and our lives and us being able to make those decisions.
Why did you decide that you wanted to live in Argentina when you were an undergrad? Like, did you have choices? Was it just like, hey?
Well, I applied for a Fulbright in Chile and ended up getting sent to Argentina. So I was delighted to be living in Argentina, but I think my level of choosing to live there was that was where I was assigned. But I really I love speaking Spanish, and I wanted to improve my Spanish and thought that the opportunity I had to be teaching English would be a great way to sort of do something active at the same time as enhancing my own language abilities. And, you learn a lot about another language and your language when you're teaching. So,
yeah.
And I just wanted to live somewhere else. It was awesome.
Yeah. So, we joined the Peace Corps right after undergrad. Mm-hmm. And the way the application process worked at that point, it took longer if you were a married couple. So we had to apply even before we'd gotten engaged to be married because we knew it was going to take a while. How'd
that conversation go, though? Let's talk more about that.
I mean, we knew that was going to, anyway.
You were going to get engaged?
Yeah.
So you had a pre-engagement conversation? So the Peace Corps facilitated your marriage, essentially.
Yeah, it's not a shotgun wedding. It's like, what would you call that?
Yeah, it's like ultra planned.
Ultra planned.
Pre-planned.
Yeah. And so we'd gotten through the interview process, and they were like, okay, these people are, I guess, legit. And they called us and they said, okay, you have 3 options of places you can go. You can go, so my husband wanted to be an environmental education person. So there are different assignments you can get. And I wanted to do health. And so they were like, well, you can get those assignments and go to sub-Saharan Africa. You can go to the Caribbean and both have I think it was community education or community engagement assignments. Or you can go to Central and South America and probably both be health. And they were like, let us know tomorrow what you want to do. And so I remember I have this very vivid memory. We pulled out an atlas, because a book with and we were like, well, we could end up there, we could go there. And we decided that we wanted, it was really important to learn Spanish or to be more skilled at speaking Spanish. And so that's why we ended up in Ecuador, which was great. So we digress. But it's relevant because we're talking with an amazing person today, Asha Dahya, who has a podcast called Green Tide Rising about the reproductive rights movement throughout Central and South America and how it parallels what's going on in the United States post-Dobbs. And I learned a lot from this conversation. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I learned a ton from the conversation and from listening to several episodes of the podcast.
I wasn't always a filmmaker, but I've always worked in entertainment. I actually started more in front of the camera. I did a degree in film and journalism in Australia. As you can tell, I have an accent. Moved over here in 2008. Great time to start in a new country just before the economy collapsed. But I started out hosting on camera, doing kids' TV, entertainment, pop culture. Did that for about a decade and then started to move behind the scenes. Went through a bunch of life changes and interests change over the way as well. And in a nutshell, I went through a divorce at 24. I left a conservative evangelical church kind of at the same time, had to start my life all over again and was working in reality TV. I worked on America's Next Top Model, started having, building a whole new group of friends and colleagues and women in film and feminists in film, and completely had my eyes opened about all the different political topics that I was taught a certain way about, and realized there is much more to the story than the narrow things that I was taught in church, specifically about abortion and bodily autonomy, equal marriage as well. At the time, that was a big topic in California. There was a big law that was being voted on, Prop 8. So that kind of really led me on a journey to want to marry my advocacy and passion with my media experience. And I guess my original intention was to be like, I'm going to show those people that from that church that I left, like, this is the truth. And then, along the way, as is what usually happens, I was changed, and I realized there is so much about this work that I need to be intentional about, and that I really want to honor the people who are going through these experiences and use my storytelling passion and media experience to do it in the right way. I started working on the short film Someone You Know in 2020, actually, and that was originally intended to be kind of like a short PSA in the lead up to that election, talking about later abortion. And Green Tide Rising was initially a docuseries idea that I had 8 years ago, even before I had kids. And that has evolved so much along the way. I've pitched it to numerous production companies in numerous iterations. And then eventually it became Green Tide Rising, focused on Latin America's green wave abortion rights movement. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into this work. And I feel very privileged and lucky that I get to use my passion and create these projects, which is definitely not easy, creating your own projects, getting the funding, getting it up off the ground. But it really is an honor to do this work, because there is such a huge need for storytelling and a need to shift the narrative in a way that centers abortion seekers and those people as the experts. So I feel like I get to do that in a little bit, in a little way, and I will continue to do that.
One of our goals and one of the themes we keep coming back to is helping people have conversations with people who might disagree with them. And it strikes me that you may have some special expertise in that, having changed your mind over time or come from a different perspective. And I'm sure having still friends, family, people you love who remained in the church and perhaps have different views than you. How have those conversations gone, or how did they evolve over time as your mind changed?
I definitely don't consider myself the expert still, but I think what has changed is my perspective on what's my motivation. I think that's the biggest thing for me. Is it it started out as, okay, my intention is to make them see the light. I've got to change their minds. I've got to do this. It's just a feeling where you're constantly fighting against something. You always feel negative. Whereas when I shifted my focus to, okay, who are the people that I am really doing this for, and who am I honoring, that helped me have a lot more peace and realize, okay, this is my lane. But in terms of the conversations that I've had with people who don't think the same as me, it's still hard, and I think that one of my neighbors, he's an elderly man. He's so lovely, and he is very involved in his church, does a lot of advocacy around young men. But we've had conversations, and it's probably the best example that I have, where he has had a certain perspective about abortion and pregnancy and the way these things go. I mean, he's a lot older than I am, but he has been so willing to listen to me. He asks genuine questions. So when I say, there's studies that show that 95% of abortion seekers do not regret their abortion, he's like, oh, hang on a minute, let me think about that. Wow, I never thought about, he genuinely stops to think about it. And when I tell him, people think of this phrase late-term abortion. That's actually not a medically accurate term. It's just abortion, but later in pregnancy. And these are the people who actually seek it, and why I personally don't believe that we need to set limits on abortion. He's like, oh, what? Okay, hang on a second. Let me think about that. Let me think, because I've never thought about it. And so the way that he asks, it's like he genuinely wants to hear my perspective, also because he knows that I've been doing this work, and so he's genuinely interested. And then I get to ask him, well, tell me about some of the people that you've been in community with, some of the stories you've heard. And I get to hear some of those as well. Like his wife was telling me, someone in our family or a close family friend had a medication abortion with the abortion pill and had a not so great experience. And, it really kind of, I wouldn't say traumatized her, but it affected her, it impacted her. And it was just great to be in a space where we could share perspectives and stories without feeling combative. Like we weren't trying to win anything or compete. It was just 2 or 3 people, him and his wife, talking and having a conversation without any agenda. And that felt beautiful and right. Like if we could do more of that, then it feels like, even though we're not trying to move toward anything, we were progressing in some way because we were able to listen. So that's probably the best example that I've had. But I've also had negative experiences as well. And from those, I've learned more, again, about myself. How do I want to approach these conversations? What do I want to share? Do I want to throw all the facts all the time, like everything everywhere all at once? Or do I just want to come with a genuine position to hear and listen and then talk where it's appropriate?
So Green Tide Rising talks about the Green Wave movement. So what is the Green Wave movement?
So the Green Wave movement happened or began in the early 2000s in Latin America. And in the podcast, they really talk about it starting in Argentina. And it was a movement to liberalize abortion laws. And part of it was a backlash against women who had been criminalized after pregnancy losses and obstetric emergencies in which they ended up in prison because they were accused of abortion. In the podcast, they take several different countries as examples. And 3 that Asha talks about are Argentina, Colombia, and El Salvador. And she contrasts the access to abortion and the policies in those countries, which have very different approaches to the law.
And I think what was particularly interesting to me is, one, that the variety in laws related to abortion access in Central and South America sort of parallel what is happening now in the U.S. after the Dobbs decision. So I think there's some interesting things we can learn from that. And then the other thing that I think is important about the Green Wave movement is that it's more focused on how access to reproductive health care and abortion is a human right, rather than it being a privacy or bodily autonomy issue, which is kind of how we focused our advocacy movements here in the U.S. And so they're focused around laws related to privacy, rather than this healthcare is important for people with capacity of pregnancy. And what we're seeing now when they have that access taken away is that it's criminalized. So we're seeing people being arrested and jailed for
in the
United States for miscarriages, for other parts of pregnancy that happen. And so we're seeing what the folks in Argentina saw. And when they faced that problem, they said, you know what, this is a human right to have access to this care. And I think we need to shift our frame in how we're fighting back for this human right.
It's kind of refreshing, actually, because we for years have used Roe v. Wade as a framework, right? And that is the basis of Roe v. Wade was based on privacy. And if you approach it, because they didn't have that protection in Latin America, they could approach it from the way that was most relevant to the care. And rather than try to find a way to sort of fit it into the United States Constitution or law, they found a way. They looked at, all right, what is this? And that's where you arrive at, all right, well, this is healthcare and this is a human right, which makes much more sense as an approach to these healthcare choices.
Exactly. And I think, it gives me a lot of hope listening to these episodes and seeing how people kind of faced the problems that they were facing, very similar to what we're facing in this post-Dobbs American landscape, And they changed the conversation around why access to this care was important.
Green Tide Rising was always designed to be a warning signal and a blueprint for American audiences. Like, look at what is happening here in our country. Let's look to our friends in the global South, across Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. They know what it's like to push for human rights and other freedoms under hostile governments. And that's where we are right now. We're seeing it every day. And so Green Tide Rising, across the 8 episodes, what we wanted to do was look at a few key countries. So we looked at Argentina, El Salvador, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and Colombia and Mexico. The reason why we focused on those certain countries was because they have different models of abortion regulations. So there's 3 different tiers, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. There's the complete ban, which is El Salvador, no exceptions. There's the mixed model where it's allowable up to a certain number of weeks, like Argentina, 14 weeks. And beyond that, there are still certain restrictions in place. And then there's Colombia, where it's decriminalized, and that is a very important key. And it's legal up to 24 weeks, but it's not in the criminal code, which means that beyond where it's allowable, it doesn't revert back to police and incarceration and the authorities and judges and courts. It is a health issue. And by taking away that criminalization from a healthcare procedure, that opens up a whole world and a whole new discussion. Even though I'm not a lawyer, I'm a little bit of a law nerd, so I really liked the conversation around episode 4, which was Colombia. It was one of the lawyers who worked on the case that liberalized Colombia's laws. And they did it the exact same year that we overturned Roe v. Wade, just a few months after. And they were, all throughout COVID, they were working on this case, and they used communications firms, and they used the media, and they tried to drum up a whole different group of support from different groups of people in society. But they could see what was happening in America, and they saw the writing on the wall, and they were nervous because they thought, if that's what's happening in the United States, what does that mean for our courts? But because of such a groundswell of movement that started in Argentina in 2018, where the Green Wave started, and it had moved throughout the region, by the time it had reached Colombia, they were protesting in the streets, even during COVID. And they were doing these amazing displays of joy and art and creativity outside the courthouse. They were doing reggaeton dances outside the courthouse, which they talked about in the podcast. So by the time it came down to making that decision, the judges saw what was happening in society. And I guess, I mean, I'm speculating here, what they had to rule on was what was happening in their country, what people actually wanted, you know. And that's what they did. And so now Colombia has one of the most progressive abortion laws in the world. And there's so much we can learn from that. And granted, there are different things about Colombia, like their constitution allows for people to take up a court case and directly challenge the constitution, which is what they did. Here in the United States, we can't do that. Unfortunately, you have to have a plaintiff. You have to have a person, you know, that, or an organization that is the representative of the case. I'm not using legal terms at all, but you understand what I mean. And the other thing that I found fascinating, speaking to the Center for Reproductive Rights folks in Latin America, was that because they've never had a Roe v. Wade type law in many of their countries, they used to look at Roe v. Wade as the gold standard, which it's, you know, anytime someone would say that, I would laugh, because by this time, Roe v. Wade was already gone. And what they said was, we are so used to taking up court cases that have a single plaintiff, whereas in the United States, your cases were about trap laws or, you know, healthcare provisions and insurance. And it was never about an individual. But now that federal protections have gone, the cases are going to be more about individuals, like we saw with Kate Cox in Texas, the woman who, by all intents and purposes, fit the so-called legal parameters, and I'm doing air quotes here, that the Texas law allowed for exceptions if it's an emergency or if your life is in danger. And she fit those parameters, yet the authorities in that state they went after her like she was like she was Al Capone or something. I mean, they really hounded her. So she had the means to travel out of state and to get a procedure at a clinic out of state. But there are other women who haven't had that. And so that's what we're going to see more of now. And I think the overarching message that our experts wanted to share was that the green wave isn't about one person or one case or one country. It really is about all of us. And our resident expert, Jimena Casas, who's a researcher and a feminist lawyer, she says, the green wave has many different green tones. There's so many roles that each of us can play, whether we're OBGYNs or filmmakers or writers or students or grandmothers. Each of us can be part of this collective movement so that by the time a case gets to the court, the culture's already been changed and the movement is already there. It's now that court has to reflect what the culture wants, as opposed to the other way around. Whereas in the United States, we've been very focused on the right, the legal right, reproductive rights, the Supreme Court. They haven't relied on that. Their focus has been on the culture first, and the courts and the Congress is the end result. And I think that's a model of strength. And I hope that we can see that more in the United States.
Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to have both English language and bilingual versions of the podcast?
Yeah, that was very intentional because we always knew that our target audience was primarily Spanish-speaking folks in the United States, and having episodes in both the Spanish and then having the dubbed episodes meant that we could reach different people and different generations in Spanish-speaking families in this country. And there are some first generation, third generation Hispanic folks some who have never spoken Spanish and some whose parents and grandparents do. So we knew that there was a way to reach different people and different generations. And of course, the Brazilian episode, we had Portuguese speakers. So we had some of those interviews we kept in Portuguese and some of them we dubbed. But it's also this idea, if I can zoom out a little bit, the political narrative that we hear, and we're seeing it now around immigration and Black and brown folks. And there's this perception of immigrants and our neighbors to the South that often becomes very condescending. And there's, a lot of racism and, those narratives that become like, we are better than, or America is the greatest and the leader. But what we wanted to show was the people that are typically demonized in political narratives and certain media narratives as well, that actually they're the leaders. These are the ones that we need to be following and taking the examples of. And they're not all necessarily famous celebrities or people in power. Some of them are everyday women, grandmothers, students, lawyers, people who are using the resources that they have, and they're making a ripple effect. They're making that change. And I think if we could reflect that to our Spanish-speaking audiences, who are all very diverse in their own right in the United States, it would empower them to know that their stories matter here as well. There is this perception that to be religious automatically equals being anti-abortion. But what I loved about Green Tide Rising was that we got to amplify these social justice badasses who come from religious communities, especially in the Catholic world. We got to highlight a few leaders from Catholics for the Right to Decide in Mexico and Argentina. And actually the woman who founded Catholics for the Right to Decide in Argentina, she came up with the idea of the green bandana. And her thought process, her name is Marta Alanis, her thought process about choosing the color green was that it's the color of life, it's nature, and reclaiming that term life, which has been co-opted by the anti-abortion side. I thought that was so genius. And now this green symbol has become a global symbol that you don't need to necessarily have words or a slogan. You see that green bandana tied around someone's arm or face or neck, and you know instantly what it stands for. And it is the life and the health and the well-being of women and people who can get pregnant to have their dignity and freedom to make these choices about their bodies and their families. It's really important to uplift religious leaders and religious folks who believe in championing a bodily autonomy, not in spite of their faith, but because of it. And because I also feel like, I'm no longer making all these projects to kind of quote unquote get back at the people like, see, I told you so, this is the right way. It's like, actually, this is your history too.
We asked Asha about the short documentary she produced called Someone You Know, about abortion later in pregnancy.
Starting this project, I was originally just hired as a producer to find stories in the abortion space, like abortion storytellers. And as I mentioned earlier, it was originally meant to be a short PSA that we were going to release in the lead up to the 2020 election. The production company who had originally hired me, they, for bandwidth reasons, couldn't dedicate any more time to it. So they gave me all the footage. And by that time, we had done 2 or 3 interviews, and they said, you can do what you want with it. And this was 2020, so it was COVID. There were a lot of restrictions around filming. And then I decided it's going to be too hard to try and go out, because one was in the Midwest, one was in Texas, and another one was in New York. And so I thought, well, what about using animation to kind of retell, especially the sensitive parts of their stories, that doing a reenactment or try to film B-roll just didn't feel right. And so I chose animation, not knowing how expensive it was, but I'm so glad I did it, because it meant that these women could share their experience in detail, and I could keep a lot of those details in the story without being too sensationalist. And, there are some trigger warnings in there, because the stories are heavy. It's about pregnancy loss. It's about obstetric emergencies. It's about the stigma and the shame, and having to travel out of state as an immigrant student, not knowing anyone. And so it really became clear to me that those stories were going to be very important, because at this point now people were really making noise about, Roe v. Wade, is it going to be overturned? I mean, people have been talking about that for years, but it was really this is now 2022 when I was almost finished the film. And then, of course, the leak came out, and then I thought, okay, this film is more timely now than what it would have been in 2020. And it premiered at a film festival in early 2024. And so the trajectory of needing to show stories of what it's like for the most vulnerable people to need abortion access at such a precarious time in their pregnancy, anything past the first trimester. I mean, I'm talking to the experts here. How harder it is to access it, how much more can go wrong in a pregnancy as the weeks and days go on. It was really important to showcase these stories and to make people aware that, when you talk about later abortion patients, this is who it is. It's someone it's your friend, it's your colleague, it's your sister, it's your mother, it's someone that you love and care for in your family. These aren't the statistics or the talking points that we hear in a lot of political debates. They're often religious people, and we're seeing this now more and more. We're seeing, conservative, religious, Republican women speaking out saying, I thought I would just get the care that I needed because I was having a miscarriage. I was having an obstetric situation where I needed care, and I had to travel out of the state. What do you mean? And so being able to connect those dots and reflect to people and audiences, this is what the experience actually looks like, and how hard it is to get an abortion later in your pregnancy, even more so now that clinics have been closing down, and doctors are leaving states because they're too afraid of, losing their license or being harassed by anti-abortion folks. It was really a privilege and an honor. And also I wanted to take great care in sharing these stories, because they're such heartbreaking experiences in so many ways. I mean, one woman talked about, Mindy Swank talked about how she came from a very conservative religious tradition where she thought, abortions were just being handed out on the corner like candy. And that soundbite didn't make it into the film. But I think so many people are familiar with this idea of, I had this perception of abortion, and I had this perception of what has been coined late-term abortion, which, like we said, is not an accurate term. And then seeing and going through it made me realize it's very expensive. It's very taxing on someone's mental and physical health. And there are situations now where women are dying. And so I feel like it's a more timely conversation than ever. And I hope as these news stories become bigger and bigger, that it is prompting people to think deeper about abortion access later in pregnancy. And that was almost always my goal. And I will say that because I've had so many conversations in making this film where very well-meaning folks would say to me, oh, yes, I'm pro-choice, but not in the 7th or 8th month. That's just taking it too far. I'm like, well, hang on a second. What do you mean by that? And where did you adopt those thoughts from? And what has now become so common in our culture that you thinking that way just feels okay or normal? I'm like, that's the audience that I need to reach and equip them with the talking points or messages or stories that they can then take and have conversations with people in their families and their circles as well. So, yeah, that was my intention. We start seeing these narratives come into play in the media in El Salvador, where they present these stories about unnatural women or women who go against what is right and good for their gender. And those are women who don't get married, who don't have children, who choose to have an abortion, or even people who have miscarriages or obstetric emergency. They're still lumped in with that kind of scarlet letter. And it was really fascinating the way that they used media and they used religion, bolstered by this political history. And then in comes the United States to add that heavy-handedness to be like, oh yes, we support this anti-abortion stance, and now that is the norm. And so any woman in El Salvador who needs to have an abortion, if you have the means, they can leave the country. If they don't have the means, well, you're going to be impacted in such horrendous ways. And so, of course, we see low-income women and Indigenous women predominantly being impacted. There are a group of 17 women who were imprisoned for obstetric emergencies, and we interviewed one of them, Teodora Vasquez. She was in prison for 11 years because she had an obstetric emergency. She was a mother. She as she was going through this horrendous experience, instead of getting medical care, she was thrown in jail and she was put in the back of a police car, and just horrendous conditions. But all of that situation was made possible by all of that history and all of that influence, outside influence. And, you know, there are people like the current president, Bukele, who a lot of the MAGA folks admire, and they hold him up and they say things like, well, he has such a low crime rate, he's cracked down on crime. But actually, which we talk about in the episode, he has, you know, there's this perception of low crime rates, and, you know, they're filling the jails. And we're seeing that now with American residents being sent to this jail in El Salvador who are not criminals. You know, what he does is he jails his opponents. And who else are other people who are in prison? They're women who are suspected of having abortions. And the other thing to think about is, which translates to what's happening in the United States, what people who are in prison, what can they not do? Vote. They don't have a say in how society changes and how it operates. Even when they are released from prison, it's very, very hard to get back on your feet and become part of the voting population. So they don't have a say in their own lives, their own bodies. And that is all by design. That's why imprisonment and criminalization of abortion is such a key part of the tactic, because, I mean, I think a lot of people might have heard a lot of noise about the Women Save Act, or this law that Republicans were trying to introduce that supposedly protected the right to vote for women. But there were a lot of loopholes in there that essentially, if you kind of fell a little bit outside those parameters, well, now you've lost the right to vote. And so that thankfully did not pass Congress, and it's not the law, but the voting rights and what you're able to do with your own body, those rights are very, very linked together. There is a huge story of hope in the green wave. And one of the cool things about Latin America is that there are so many different countries, and that kind of mirrors the 50 states that we have, because each state is like its own country in a way. And so different culture, different types of people in power and all of that. So I think there are some really great parallels and lessons we can learn from Latin America. But the story of hope is in the everyday people. And I can't emphasize that enough. I know it sounds so cliched, but it really is true. I mean, that movement was made possible by everyday people understanding the larger human rights implication of taking away bodily autonomy, because that's what this is about. It's not just the right to one specific medical procedure. It's all the rights you have about your body. It's trans rights. It's who you can marry. It's, how you can work and have accommodations, all the different things that matter to our bodies and our lives and us being able to make those decisions. And so the best advice that I learned from the experts in this podcast, both in Latin America and some here in the United States, Paula Mendoza, who's originally from Colombia and now works in New York, she talks about community activism being the most powerful way forward to see progress in the United States. And I do believe that too. When we look at the presidential elections or the Supreme Court appointments, it feels so heavy and so overwhelming, and it almost feels like a lost cause, which in some ways it is. But the hope is that we're the ones that we've been waiting for. We can help each other, even in the small ways. And that may not seem like much on the surface or as you're listening to me talk, but being able to bring someone a meal who has an abortion at home and they can't go to the store, or they don't have a community, doing things like that, like offering to babysit someone's child if they need to travel somewhere, offering to pay for medication abortion, or just showing up for each other and sharing resources. There are so many great ways to be that community activist, and it doesn't have to be an overwhelming or scary or intimidating thing.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are our own. Philanthropy is helping us highlight these stories, and we hope you'll continue supporting this work by subscribing and sharing the show and getting involved in your local community.